Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to undertake a really rigorous historical deconstruction of the American cowboy. We are going to completely strip away those Gilded Age dime novel fictions to reveal the grueling, diverse, and heavily capitalized reality of 19th century pastoral labor. By treating the past as a living civilization and relying on hard historical evidence, we're moving right past the Hollywood myth of the Wild West to uncover how ordinary people actually lived, breathed, and labored out on the frontier.
So, I want you to challenge your assumptions for just a second. When you think of a cowboy, what comes to mind? Probably a solitary gunslinger, right? Absolute liberty, roaming across a pristine, empty landscape. Well, actually, scratch that. The historical reality was vastly different. The true existence of a post-Civil War cowboy was defined by relentless physical trauma and systemic economic exploitation. It was an exhausted, highly teamwork-dependent agricultural workforce. These massive cattle drives required crews of a dozen or more. You had trail bosses, cooks, wranglers, and drag riders, and they completely, literally depended on each other for their day-to-day survival. It wasn't about solitary heroism. It was about grueling collaborative labor.
Section 1. Faces of the Open Range. Now, the popular representation of the frontier cowboy has long been, quite frankly, whitewashed, but the actual demographic data reveals a really surprising reality. Did you know that an estimated 25%, that's 1 in every 4 trail cowboys, were African American? Following the Civil War, the expanding cattle industry provided formerly enslaved individuals with a desperately needed source of employment. They were utilizing highly specialized cattle handling and horse-breaking skills that they had actually acquired during enslavement. And they were working right alongside Mexican vaqueros. The vaqueros were the ones who actually established the foundational techniques, the vocabulary, and the equipment of the trade, things like the lasso and the specific saddle designs. And of course, there were also Native American and white cowboys making up this incredibly diverse workforce.
To really ground our understanding, let's look at a primary source. This quote is from the autobiography of Nat Love, who is a very famous African-American cowboy. He writes about the profound camaraderie out on the trail, noting that men were, quote, always ready to share their blanket and their last ration. You see, because the shared daily dangers of the cattle drive absolutely necessitated egalitarian collaboration, strict segregation on the trail was just completely impractical. However, we have to recognize the severe constraints of their world. Systemic discrimination still persisted deeply. Non-white cowboys were routinely excluded from leadership roles, they received unequal treatment, and the moment they rode off the trail and into those cattle towns, they faced immediate and severe segregation.
Section 2. The Daily Grind and Deadly Hazards. The physical reality of the trail was, in a word, relentless. These laborers worked up to 108 hours a week. Think about that. That is 16 hours a day, Monday through Saturday, and a 12-hour shift on Sunday. They endured chronic muscle deterioration, permanently blistered extremities, and this suffocating flour-fine alkaline dust. It was especially brutal for the guys assigned the grueling task of riding drag, which meant eating the dust at the very back of the herd. And then there were the lethal weather extremes. Just imagine the sensory terror of a sudden, violent thunderstorm on the open plains, blinding lightning strikes that could instantly kill a trail hand, and apple-sized hail that battered their bodies and routinely triggered catastrophic fatal night stampedes.
And this brings us to a really sobering statistic. The average life expectancy for a frontier laborer was shockingly low, merely 35 to 45 years. To put that into perspective, it was a severe mortality rate, stemming directly from continuous, unprotected exposure to the elements. Add to that the extreme physical dangers of handling wild livestock, crossing swollen, rushing rivers, and dealing with an absolute, total lack of professional medical care. Make no mistake, this was not a life of romantic leisure. It was a daily, grinding fight for survival against an entirely unforgiving landscape.
The brutal medical realities of this 19th century trail were inescapable. Cholera, which is a waterborne bacteria that thrived in the stagnant, polluted water sources along the trail, was the #1 killer. It was terrifying. It could attack a perfectly healthy man at breakfast, and he would literally be in his grave by noon. And the treatment? Often nothing more than a little camphor or laudanum. Then you had scurvy, stemming from a diet completely devoid of vitamin C, and alkaline poisoning from drinking bad prairie water, which just slowly, agonizingly broke down their bodies. On top of the diseases, wagon accidents were incredibly common. Men were crushed by heavy wheels or dragged by panicked draft animals, leaving many with permanent disabilities or fatal internal hemorrhaging.
Section 3. The Cowboy Strike of 1883.
Okay, so by the early 1880s, the cattle industry had started attracting massive investments from Eastern and European financial syndicates. These giant corporate interests came in and consolidated vast tracts of land into industrialized operations. Previously, a cowboy could actually take part of his pay in calves, known as mavericks, which gave him a legitimate path to build his own small herd over time. But these new corporate syndicates put a stop to that. They insisted on strict wage labor, completely taking away the right to mavericks, and instead compensated the hands with just 30 and found, meaning a flat $30 a month plus basic room and board. The independent historical laborer was being rapidly, systematically commodified.
Well, these laborers didn't just take this lying down. They pushed back against this corporate commodification with the totally forgotten cowboy strike of 1883. Led by a cowboy named Tom Harris, crews from several of the major ranches drafted a formal ultimatum demanding higher, fair wages. Management's intimidation tactics began in late March, which led to an official strike on March 31st. Up to 325 highly skilled workers just walked out. And they did it right during the critical spring cattle drives, the exact time when their geographic knowledge and handling skills were most desperately needed by the syndicates. It's an absolutely fascinating, poignant moment of Gilded Age labor militancy happening right smack in the middle of the Wild West.
Section 4. The Great Die-Up.
The atmosphere of impending doom really began in the summer of 1886. Severe drought struck the Great Plains, leaving the ranges totally depleted, and the cattle malnourished heading into fall. And the folk knowledge of experienced stockmen told them something terrible was brewing. They started noticing their horses growing unusually thick winter coats way too early in the season. They even reported bizarre sightings of Arctic white owls migrating far, far south of their typical range. Nature itself was providing these incredibly ominous warnings. And then the winter catastrophe of 1886 to 1887 finally hit. It started with a brutal November ice storm that sealed whatever remaining grass there was beneath an impenetrable crust of ice. By January, the temperatures plummeted to an unimaginable 55 degrees below zero. Now, wild bison possessed the natural instinct to face storms head-on and paw through the snow to find forage, but millions of domesticated European cattle, they did not. They just drifted aimlessly with the freezing wind until they hit the newly built barbed wire fences. And there, they simply huddled together and froze to death standing upright. Countless cowboys perished in completely futile, desperate attempts to rescue them in the whiteout conditions.
When the spring thaw finally arrived, the sensory aftermath was truly staggering. We're talking about an estimated 60 to 90% of the total herds in places like Montana and the eastern regions being wiped out, dead. Rivers were entirely clogged with rotting carcasses, poisoning the local water supply, and this overwhelming, suffocating stench of decay hung over the entire region for months. This single, horrific environmental collapse resulted in the total financial ruin of the open-range system. It literally bankrupted massive international syndicates and future U.S. presidents alike.
Section 5. Technologies of Closure.
Following that disaster, the open range didn't just naturally fade away. It was systematically closed off by 4 key technologies. First, barbed wire allowed homesteaders and the surviving ranchers to cheaply, effectively fence off vast areas of land. Second and third, the steel-bladed plow and the windmill enabled these newly stationary settlers to cultivate winter fodder and tap deep underground water sources, completely eliminating the need for cattle to roam freely looking for resources. And finally, the rapid expansion of the railroads directly into Texas and the plains meant there was absolutely no need for 1,000-mile cattle drives anymore. The cows could just be loaded onto a train.
This technological shift fundamentally, permanently altered the role of the cowboy. Almost overnight, we see a shift from the roaming trail hand to the stationary ranch hand. The days of geographic mobility and long drives across open plains were completely over. Cowboys became permanent employees bound to smaller, strictly fenced ranches. They were put on rigid schedules, tasked with harvesting hay to feed the stock through the winter, inspecting grass levels, and constantly, endlessly, mending miles and miles of barbed wire boundaries. That mythic adventure was entirely replaced by the highly structured, mundane routine of industrial agriculture. And the historical trauma of this demanding, isolating labor carries right through to today. Modern cowboy Waddy Mitchell says it perfectly. You don't learn much when everything goes right. It's the things that go wrong that show you who you are. Today's agricultural sector still grapples heavily with the severe consequences of this lifestyle. Pastoral laborers face profound psychological isolation out on the range, often turning to self-medication to cope with chronic physical pain and relentless economic instability.
Tragically, soaring rural suicide rates still plague the descendants of this agrarian labor class, which just highlights the stark, heartbreaking contrast between the cowboy myth we love and their ongoing reality.
So I want to leave you with a provocative thought as we wrap up. Why do we collectively choose to remember the romanticized myth of unyielding liberty rather than the extraordinary, grueling reality of these historical laborers? Somewhere along the line, society replaced a diverse, suffering, resilient, and collaborative workforce with a sanitized, marketable Hollywood illusion. But by understanding the real sensory, material, and economic truths of the 19th century trail, we not only honor the real human beings who actually lived it, but we gain a much deeper understanding of the immense forces that shaped our past. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.